The wind did not merely blow across the high plains of Wyoming Territory in the late 1880s. It scoured. It possessed a physical weight, a relentless shoving hand that sought to grind the very mountains down to grit and strip the hope from anything soft enough to bleed. To Eliza Hart, watching the desolate landscape roll by through the scratched glass of a swaying stagecoach window, the land looked less like a new beginning and more like a vast, brown ocean where a person could drown without ever touching water. It was late October, but the sky was already the color of a bruised plum, hanging low and heavy over the jagged spine of the distant mountains. The stagecoach had been rattling over the rutted earth for 3 days since leaving the railhead, and every bone in Eliza's body felt loose in its socket. She clutched a worn carpetbag in her lap, her knuckles white against the fading floral pattern of the fabric. Inside that bag, tucked between a spare shift and a Bible she rarely read, was a letter. The handwriting was precise, heavy with ink, and devoid of unnecessary flourishes. It was a letter of engagement from Thomas Avery, a man she had met only twice in Philadelphia before he moved west to manage a bank, a man who had written to her father's creditors and offered to settle the family debts if Eliza would come to him. He had promised to take care of her. The coach lurched violently, hitting a pothole deep enough to swallow a boot, and the driver shouted a curse at the team of horses. As they crested a rise, the town finally appeared. It was a grid of raw lumber and mud huddled against the vast emptiness, bisected by the twin iron rails of the train tracks that were its lifeline. Smoke rose straight up from a dozen chimneys before being snatched away by the gale. It looked small. It looked hard. When the coach finally groaned to a halt in front of the station, the door was yanked open by a station agent. But it was Thomas Avery who stepped forward to help her down. He looked exactly as the town felt, solid, expensive, and unyielding. He wore a heavy wool coat with a velvet collar and a hat that cost more than Eliza's father had made in a year. "Eliza, I trust the journey was tolerable," Thomas said, taking her hand. His grip was dry and firm, lacking any tremor of excitement. It was long. "Thomas," Eliza said, her voice raspy from the dust that coated her throat. She stepped down into the frozen mud, her legs trembling. Thomas did not ask if she was hungry or if she needed to sit. Instead, he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and turned her toward the street. "Look there," he said, pointing a gloved finger. He gestured not to the people or the sunset, but to the structures. "That is the bank," he said. "The only brick building west of the river for 40 miles, solid. And there, on the rise, is the church. We helped fund the steeple last autumn. And see that ridge?" Eliza squinted against the grit stinging her eyes. "Beyond the ridge lies the Black Ridge Ranch," Thomas said, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "Mr. Harlan Blackridge runs 10,000 head of cattle. I handle his accounts. It is a kingdom, Eliza, and we are the gatekeepers." He spoke of land and money, of influence and bricks, while Eliza stood swaying with exhaustion, the wind cutting through her thin traveling coat. He did not ask about her mother, who had cried when she left, or her own health. He looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture he had ordered from a catalog, finally arrived, slightly dusty, but acceptable. "I have arranged lodgings for you," Thomas continued, marching her down the boardwalk. "You cannot stay at the hotel. It is not suitable for a woman of your future standing. You will board with Mrs. Gable behind the dress shop. It is respectable." The room was small, a lean-to addition on the back of a dressmaker's shop that smelled of starch and lavender water. It was cold. A single iron bed frame sat against the wall, and the window rattled in its frame with every gust. "You will work with Mrs. Gable until the wedding," Thomas informed her, standing in the doorway but not entering. "It will keep you occupied. I do not want you idle. Idleness leads to melancholy." Eliza nodded, too tired to argue. "Thank you." "Thomas." He looked at her, his eyes assessing the pale curve of her cheek and the shadows under her eyes. "You must eat more. Eliza, I need a strong wife. This country does not forgive weakness." He left her there, closing the door firmly. Eliza sat on the edge of the mattress, the silence of the room ringing in her ears. She was safe from the debts that had crushed her family. She was engaged to a wealthy man. She had escaped the soot-stained brick alleys of the East. She put her face in her hands and did not cry, because she had learned years ago that tears changed nothing. November arrived with teeth. The wind never stopped. It was a constant physical assault, scraping the skin from Eliza's face whenever she stepped outside. She spent her days in the front of the shop, her fingers flying over hems and seams, altering silk dresses for the wives of the few wealthy merchants and ranchers. She quickly learned her place in the social geography of the town. The women she sewed for spoke over her head as if she were part of the machinery. They discussed teas and socials, complaining about the dust while Eliza knelt on the floorboards with pins in her mouth. They looked down on her, not with malice, but with the casual indifference one reserves for a servant. She was from nowhere. She had no people. She was Thomas Avery's charity case, the poor relation bought and paid for. When she walked to the mercantile to buy thread, men lounging outside the saloon would tip their hats back and whistle low and sharp. They watched her with hungry, bored eyes. Thomas never saw this, or if he did, he never spoke of it. His interactions with her were precise and transactional. He would call on her on Sunday afternoons, sitting in Mrs. Gable's parlor, telling her about the loans he had approved or the cattle prices in Chicago. He would ask if she needed money, and when she said no, he would nod with satisfaction, as if she had passed a test of thrift. To fill the empty hours and to earn a few dollars of her own, money Thomas did not know about, Eliza took a position as a part-time teacher. The town council did not want to pay for a school for the children of the homesteaders, the families living in sod shacks and tar paper shanties out on the flats. So the families had cobbled together a salary of eggs, firewood, and copper pennies, and Eliza walked 2 miles out of town 3 days a week to a drafty one-room schoolhouse. The walk was brutal. The prairie was a flat, gray expanse of sagebrush and hard earth. To the west, the mountains were always there, shimmering with snow that crept lower down the peaks each week. They made Eliza feel small. They made her feel fragile, like a dried leaf waiting to be snapped. Yet, she preferred the biting wind to the memory of the factory. Sometimes, when the silence of the plains became too loud, the memories would ambush her. She would smell the rancid oil of the looms and hear the deafening clatter of the shuttles. She would remember the day the machine belt snapped, the scream that was cut short, and the sight of her friend Mary crushed before the gears could be stopped. She would remember the winter her brother William coughed his life away in their tenement room, his skin burning with fever, while her mother counted coins on the table and realized they were $5 short of a doctor's fee. William had died because they were poor. That was the simple, cold truth of it. Eliza had sworn over his grave that she would never be helpless again. She would marry Thomas Avery. She would live in the house on the hill. She would be cold, if necessary, but she would never again watch someone she loved die for lack of a gold coin. But the eyes of the children in the schoolhouse haunted her. They were thin, their wrists like dry twigs, wrapped in coats that were 3 sizes too big or patched until the original fabric was gone. They looked at her with a desperate kind of hope. One Tuesday in early December, Thomas was waiting for her when she returned to town. He stood outside the dress shop, his pocket watch in his hand. "You are late," he said. "I had to stay," Eliza said, brushing dust from her skirt. "The McCrae boy is struggling with his reading. He tries so hard, Thomas, but his eyes are bad." Thomas snapped the watch shut. "You are spending too much time with those scrub homesteader brats. Eliza, it does not look good. They are children," she said, surprised by the sharpness in her own voice. "They are the children of failures," Thomas said, his voice lowering to a reasonable, terrifying calm. "Their fathers borrowed money they cannot pay back. They scratch at the dirt and expect the world to feed them. You are to be my wife. Eliza, my wife does not trudge through the mud to teach the alphabet to paupers. It is honest work," Eliza said. "It is beneath you," he countered. "I have paid your debts. I have brought you here to be a lady, not a nursemaid to the rabble. You will resign from the school." Eliza felt a flash of heat that had nothing to do with the stove inside the shop. "You do not own me." "Thomas, not yet." He stepped closer, his bulk blocking the last of the fading sunlight. He smiled, a tight stretching of his lips that did not reach his eyes. "Do not be dramatic. My dear, I am simply protecting my investment. You are tired. You are not thinking clearly. Go inside. We will speak when you are rational." He turned and walked away toward the bank, his boots clicking rhythmically on the boardwalk. Eliza stood trembling, her hands balled into fists at her sides. The condescension, the ownership, the suffocation of his care hit her all at once. She could not go inside the small, dark room. She could not smell the lavender and starch. She needed air. She turned and walked. She did not head toward the main street. She walked past the livery stable, past the last few shacks of the town, and out onto the rutted wagon track that led toward the open prairie. She needed to breathe air that Thomas Avery had not already used. She walked fast, her boots crunching on the frozen earth, the anger propelling her forward until the town was just a smear of gray smoke behind her. She did not notice the sky changing. In the high country, the weather does not turn, it strikes. The blue-gray clouds that had been loitering on the horizon suddenly surged forward, driven by a wind that dropped the temperature 20 degrees in the span of 10 minutes. It was a blue norther, the kind of storm old-timers warned about, the kind that killed cattle where they stood. The first flakes were not soft. They were hard pellets of ice that stung like buckshot. Eliza stopped, blinking, and looked up. The sky had vanished. The mountains were gone. A wall of white was racing toward her across the flats, devouring the world. She turned to run back, but the wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, staggering her. The snow began to slash sideways, thick and blinding. In seconds, the wagon track she'd been following was erased, the ruts filled with white, the horizon dissolved. Eliza pulled her coat tighter, ducking her head, but the cold was instant and invasive. It soaked through the thin wool of her coat, through her dress, through her skin, settling deep in her bones. She stumbled forward, eyes squinted shut against the stinging ice. "Thomas," she thought, a sudden, irrational apology rising in her throat. But Thomas was miles away, likely sitting by a coal fire, drinking brandy. She walked for what felt like an hour, but might have been 10 minutes. The cold made her clumsy. Her feet felt like blocks of wood. She could not feel her toes. She stopped to get her bearings, but there were no bearings to get. There was only the howling white void, screaming in her ears, disorienting her inner ear until she didn't know if she was walking toward town or out into the endless, empty miles of the territory. Panic, cold and sharp as a knife, sliced through her chest. This was how it ended. Not in a warm bed, but here, erased by the wind. She remembered the factory again, the feeling of being trapped in a system too big to fight. The West was just another machine, bigger and colder. She tripped over a hidden sagebrush root and fell hard. The snow rushed up to meet her, surprisingly soft, deceptively welcoming. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook uncontrollably. The cold was making her sleepy. It whispered to her that it would be easier to just lie there. The wind roared, sounding like the noise of the great looms back east, grinding, grinding. "No," she gasped, the word lost in the gale. She managed to get to her knees, but the world tilted. She collapsed again, curling into a ball near the edge of a shallow gully. The snow began to pile against her back immediately, burying her. Then, through the roar of the wind, she felt a vibration in the ground, a rhythmic thudding. She forced her eyes open. A dark shape was tearing through the white curtain. A horse, a massive, dark beast, chest heaving, struggling against the drifts. "Hey!" The voice was rough, shouting over the wind. Eliza tried to lift her arm, but it was too heavy. The horse pulled up, snorting, hooves kicking up sprays of snow. A figure vaulted from the saddle before the animal had even fully stopped. He hit the ground running, stumbling in the deep drift, and then he was there, looming over her. He was a shadow in the storm. A cowboy's hat was pulled low and tied down with a scarf, the brim caked in ice. He dropped to his knees beside her, grabbing her shoulders with hands that felt like iron clamps. "Don't you go to sleep," he roared, his face inches from hers. He grabbed her, not gently, but with a frantic necessity. He hauled her up from the snow as if she weighed nothing. Eliza's head lolled back. She saw a jawline covered in rough stubble, a white scar running from his ear down to his chin, and eyes that were dark and fierce. "Can you stand?" he shouted. She tried to nod, but her knees buckled. Damn it, he swore. He didn't wait. He swept an arm behind her knees and another around her back, lifting her high against his chest. He turned into the wind, hunching his broad shoulders to shield her. "Easy, girl. I got you." He carried her to the horse, a towering animal that pinned its ears back against the storm. The man, whoever he was, moved with a fluid, desperate strength. He hefted her up into the saddle, shouting at the horse to stand, then swung up behind her. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat and pulled the edges around her, enveloping her in the smell of wet wool, tobacco, and warm animal. He wrapped his arms around her waist, trapping her hands against his chest to share his heat. "Hold on," he shouted into her ear. "We can't make town." "The drifts are too deep in the cut." Eliza couldn't answer. She could only shake, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. The man kicked the horse into motion. They didn't head back the way she thought the town was. He turned the horse toward the dark shape of the hills. The ride was a blur of misery. The wind tried to tear them from the saddle. The horse stumbled once, twice, but the man's grip on the reins was steady, his other arm clamping Eliza to him like a vice. He kept talking to her, his voice a low rumble in his chest against her back. "Stay with me. Almost there. Don't quit now. You hear me? Don't you quit." Time lost its meaning. There was only the cold and the heat of the stranger's body behind her. Just when Eliza thought she would slip into the darkness, the horse stopped. A shape loomed out of the swirling snow, a low timber structure half buried in a drift, a line cabin. The man slid off the horse and reached up, pulling Eliza down into his arms. Her legs wouldn't work at all now. He kicked the door. It was frozen shut. He kicked it again, harder, and it gave way with a crack of ice. He carried her inside and kicked the door shut behind them, plunging them into sudden, ringing silence. The wind still howled, but it was outside now, a beast scratching at the walls. The cabin was freezing, the air stale and dry. The man deposited her on a rough wooden bunk in the corner and immediately went to work. He moved by feel in the dark, his boots thumping on the floorboards. A match flared, erratic and bright, and then a lantern sputtered to life, casting long, jumping shadows. Eliza sat on the bunk, shivering so violently her heels drummed against the wood frame. She watched him through half-closed eyes. He was lean, dressed in worn denim and chaps that were dark with melted snow. He moved with a focused efficiency, ignoring his own shivering. He knelt at the small iron stove, shoving kindling and wood inside. Within minutes, the roar of a fire joined the sound of the wind. The man stood up and turned to her. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and melted snow. The scar on his jaw stood out pale against his wind-burned skin. "We need to get those wet things off," he said. His voice was quieter now, rough with the cold. He knelt before her. He didn't ask permission. There was no time for modesty. He took her foot, resting it on his knee, and worked the laces of her sodden boots. His fingers were large, calloused, and stained with work, but they moved with surprising dexterity. He pulled the boots off, then the wet stockings. He took her hands next. They were white, the fingernails blue. He frowned, his brow furrowing. He pulled off her gloves and enclosed her hands in his own. His hands were rough, warm, and alive. He began to rub her skin, brisk friction that burned. "Feel that?" he asked, looking up at her. Eliza nodded, a gasp escaping her lips as the blood began to return with stinging pain. "Yes, good. Pain is good. It means you ain't dead." He grabbed a rough wool blanket from the end of the bunk and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard, watching her face. "You're lucky, miss," he said. "Another hour out there and you'd be a statue." Eliza looked at him. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped now that the immediate crisis was past. He was a stranger, a drifter, a man Thomas would not even look at in the street, and he was currently the only thing standing between her and the dark. "Who are you?" she whispered. He hesitated, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw. "Cole," he said. "Cole Maddox. I ride for the Blackridge outfit. Eliza Hart." She managed to say, "I know," Cole said. "Everyone knows who you are. You're the banker's girl." The words hung in the air between them. The banker's girl. Property. Cole stood up and moved to the stove, checking the fire. He put a kettle of snow on top to melt. The cabin was small, barely 10 feet square. There was the bunk, the stove, a table with one broken leg, and the overwhelming intimacy of two people breathing the same air in a space meant for solitude. He seemed to feel it too. He kept his back to her for a long moment, warming his hands over the stove. "I can't take you back tonight," he said, speaking to the iron pipe. "Storm's too thick. Horse would break a leg. We have to wait it out." "I know," Eliza said. Her shivering was subsiding to a steady tremble. "It ain't proper," Cole said, turning to face her. "People will talk. You know that. Let them talk," Eliza said. The anger she had felt earlier returned, but it was quiet now, tempered by the reality of the ice outside. "I would be dead if not for you." Cole looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He didn't look at her like the men outside the saloon, with hunger. And he didn't look at her like Thomas, with appraisal. He looked at her with a confusing mixture of curiosity and wariness, like she was a dangerous animal he had accidentally trapped. "Why were you out there?" he asked. "Dressed like that, walking into a norther?" Eliza pulled the blanket tighter. "I needed to walk. I didn't see the storm coming." "You were running away," Cole corrected gently. "I've seen that look before. A horse gets it right before it breaks a fence." Eliza looked down at her hands, still tingling with the ghost of his touch. "I feel like I've been running for a long time," she admitted softly. "I thought coming west would be different. I thought it would be free. Free." Cole scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "There ain't nothing free out here, Miss Hart. The wind takes what it wants. The land takes the rest. And men like Blackridge and your Mr. Avery, they take whatever's left over." He poured hot water into a tin cup and brought it to her. His fingers brushed hers as she took it. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt that made her breath hitch. "I made mistakes," Cole said, stepping back quickly, retreating to the other side of the small room. "I drifted up from Texas. Left a lot of things behind. Buried a brother down in Kansas." "You lost a brother?" Eliza asked. Cole nodded, his face tightening. "Range war. He was young. Didn't know when to duck, I learned. I lost a brother too," Eliza said, to a cough, "because we couldn't pay a doctor." Cole looked at her, his eyes softening. The hardness that defined his face, the scar, the set of his jaw, seemed to crack just a fraction. "Then I guess we both know how cold the world can get," he said. The wind shrieked outside, rattling the door on its hinges, trying to find a way in. But inside, the fire popped and hissed. The warmth was spreading through the room, smelling of pine smoke and damp wool. Eliza looked at Cole Maddox. He was leaning against the rough log wall, watching the door as if he expected the storm to kick it in. He looked dangerous. He looked worn, but he had ridden into the white void when no one else had. He had pulled her from the snow. She remembered Thomas's clean, manicured hands and how cold they felt. She looked at Cole's hands, scarred and dirty, hanging by his sides. "Mr. Maddox," she whispered. He looked at her. "Yeah, thank you," she said. I have never felt anyone fight for my life like that." Cole held her gaze. The silence stretched, heavy and filled with things that shouldn't be true but were, The way he looked at her wasn't guarded anymore. It was open. It was gentle. And under the gentleness, there was a terrifying spark of recognition, as if he saw the same loneliness in her that lived in him. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. Once. Slowly. But the look passed between them. A fragile, invisible thread spun in the heart of the storm. Eliza felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It terrified her. It was the most dangerous thing she had felt since stepping off the train. She took a sip of the hot water, watching him over the rim of the tin cup, and knew, with a sinking, soaring certainty, that the storm had changed everything. Dawn broke over the high plains not with warmth, but with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy on the eardrums. The world had been scoured clean and buried under 2 feet of snow that had drifted into waves against the cabin walls. Inside the small line cabin, the light that filtered through the cracks in the chinking was pale and blue, the color of skimmed milk. Eliza's heart woke with a start, her body stiff on the wooden bunk. For a moment, disoriented by the strange smell of pine pitch and wood smoke, she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the blizzard rushed back, the blinding white, the cold that had tried to stop her heart, and the man who had pulled her from it. She sat up, pulling the rough wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Across the small room, Cole Maddox was already awake. He stood by the cast-iron stove, his back to her, feeding the last of the split logs into the fire. He moved with a quiet economy, careful not to make noise, but the creak of his leather chaps gave him away. "Good morning," Eliza said, her voice raspy. Cole turned. The morning light was unforgiving. It highlighted the exhaustion etched into his face and the jagged line of the scar that ran along his jaw. He looked at her, then quickly looked away, focusing his attention on the coffee pot bubbling on the stove. "Morning," he replied. His voice was low, rough with sleep. Snow's stopped. Sky is clear. He poured coffee into 2 battered tin cups. There was no sugar, no cream, just the bitter, black liquid that smelled of burnt beans. He brought a cup to her, along with a plate of heated beans he had scraped from a skillet. "It ain't much," Cole said, offering the plate, "but it will put heat in your belly. You'll need it for the ride back." Eliza took the cup, her fingers brushing his for the briefest second. The heat of the metal seeped into her cold palms. "Thank you." They ate in silence. It was an awkward, heavy silence, thick with the unspoken awareness that they had spent the night alone in a space no bigger than a pantry. Eliza was acutely conscious of her disheveled hair and her wrinkled dress. Cole seemed to shrink into himself, eating standing up, his eyes fixed on the frost pattern swirling on the single small window pane. He was a man who clearly knew the rules of the world, that a cowboy and a banker's fiancée did not share breakfast, and he seemed burdened by the weight of the trouble that was likely waiting for them. When the last of the coffee was gone, Cole set his cup down with a finality that made Eliza jump. "We best get moving," he said. "The sun will soften the drifts by noon, but the wind will pick up again. I need to get you back before people start wondering more than they already are." He went to the door and shoved his shoulder against it. It held fast for a moment, sealed by ice, before giving way with a loud crack and a shower of white powder. The air that rushed in was sharp enough to freeze the breath in Eliza's lungs. Beyond the door, the land was a blinding white desert. The sky was a hard, relentless blue, stretching endlessly over the glittering plains. It was beautiful, but it was a cruel beauty, indifferent to whether anyone lived or died within it. Cole saddled his horse, the large dark gelding he called Rooster. The animal snorted, its breath pluming like dragon smoke in the frigid air. Cole led the horse to the cabin door and mounted, then reached down for Eliza. "Put your foot on my boot," he instructed. "Grab my arm." Eliza hesitated, then did as he asked. He pulled her up behind him with an easy strength. She settled onto the horse's rump, feeling precarious. "You have to hold on," Cole said, not looking back. "Put your arms around my waist." Eliza reached around him. His coat was heavy sheepskin, rough and smelling of the storm. She clasped her hands together at his front, feeling the solid, warm wall of his body against her chest. It was improper. It was scandalous. And as they set off into the drifts, it was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. The ride back to town took 3 hours. They moved slowly, the horse plunging chest deep into snowbanks, snorting with effort. The wind bit at Eliza's cheeks, stinging her eyes, but the heat radiating from Cole was a steady furnace. She could feel the rhythm of his breathing and the way his muscles shifted as he guided the horse in the vast emptiness of the plains, with nothing but the curvature of the earth visible in all directions. The physical connection between them felt magnified. She was literally clinging to him for survival, her face pressed against the wool of his coat to shield herself from the wind. As the town came into view, a smudge of gray wood and coal smoke against the pristine snow, Eliza felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She loosened her grip on Cole, pulling back slightly, remembering who she was and who was waiting for her. Cole seemed to sense her withdrawal. He stiffened, his posture becoming more rigid as the first buildings grew closer. When they rode down the main street, the town was already awake. Men were shoveling snow from the boardwalks. A wagon was struggling through the slush. As Cole's horse plodded down the center of the muddy thoroughfare, heads turned. Eliza felt the weight of their eyes. Misses. Gable was sweeping the front of the dress shop and stopped, her broom held suspended in mid-air, her mouth slightly open. 2 men outside the saloon nudged each other and pointed. The silence that followed them was louder than the wind had been. A young woman returning to town on the back of a drifter's horse, wearing the same clothes as the day before, hair wind-blown. It was a picture that needed no caption for the town's gossips. Cole rode straight to the bank. He pulled the horse up, the animal blowing hard. Before Eliza could even slide down, the heavy oak door of the bank flew open. Thomas Avery strode out, hatless, his face a mask of pale fury. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man whose property had been mishandled. "Eliza!" Thomas barked, descending the steps 2 at a time. Cole dismounted and reached up to help Eliza down, but Thomas shouldered past him, grabbing Eliza by the arm and hauling her onto the boardwalk. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her flesh through the sleeve of her coat, hard enough to bruise. "Where have you been?" Thomas demanded, his voice pitching high enough for the people watching from the street to hear. "The entire town has been looking for you. Do you have any idea the worry you have caused? The sheer recklessness, walking out into a storm. I got lost." "Thomas," Eliza stammered, the cold leaving her limbs shaking. "The storm came so fast. You have embarrassed me." "Eliza," Thomas hissed, leaning close, the smell of bay rum and stale cigar smoke on his breath. "Look at you, like a common stray dragged in from the fields." Cole stepped forward. He stood on the street, looking up at Thomas on the boardwalk. He didn't raise his voice, but the steel in it cut through Thomas's tirade. She would have frozen to death. Avery. Thomas whipped his head around, looking at Cole as if he were a stain on the hem of his coat. "I did not ask you," he snapped. "I found her half buried 3 miles out." Cole continued, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "The storm was too bad to ride back. We holed up in the South Line cabin. I brought her back the minute the sun was up." Thomas looked from Cole to Eliza, his eyes narrowing. He seemed to be calculating the damage, not to Eliza's health, but to his own standing. He released Eliza's arm with a shove that sent her stumbling slightly against the wall of the bank. "I suppose I should thank you for returning her," Thomas said, his tone flat and dismissive. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. He flipped it into the air. It landed in the mud at Cole's feet with a wet splat. "For your trouble." Cole looked at the coin in the mud, then up at Thomas. His eyes were dark, dangerous, burning with a quiet rage that Eliza had never seen in a man before. He didn't move to pick it up. "Keep your money," Cole said softly. He turned his gaze to Eliza. For a second, the anger vanished, replaced by that same conflicted gentleness she had seen in the cabin. "Take care of yourself, Miss Hart," he said. He swung back into the saddle and turned the horse, riding away without looking back. Thomas watched him go, a sneer curling his lip. "Filthy animal," Thomas muttered. "Come inside, Eliza, before anyone else sees you looking like this." The scandal moved faster than the telegraph. By the time Eliza had washed and changed in her small room behind the dress shop, the story had mutated. She was sitting on her bed, trying to stop her hands from trembling, when she heard voices through the thin partition wall that separated her room from the shop floor. "Mrs. Gable had customers. It is simply shocking." A woman's voice said, "Mrs. Miller, the mayor's wife, to be out all night, with one of Blackridge's hands. We all know what sort of men they are. Drifters, criminals, and her engaged to Mr. Avery," another voice added, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If I were him, I would send her back east on the next train. Who knows what happened in that cabin?" "Nothing happened," Eliza wanted to scream. "We ate beans and shivered and survived." But she stayed silent, hugging her knees to her chest. The words cut her like knives. In the factory back east, reputation had been a luxury the poor could not afford. Here, it was currency, and hers had just been devalued to nothing. She realized with a sickening lurch that the truth did not matter. The optics were all that counted. She was the woman who slept in a cabin with a cowboy. When she emerged later that afternoon, unable to bear the walls closing in, she walked not to the bank, but out toward the prairie schoolhouse. Thomas had forbidden it, but Thomas was currently ignoring her, punishing her with silence. The schoolhouse was freezing. The cast-iron stove in the corner was cold, the wood box empty. The children were huddled together on the benches, their breath visible in the air. They looked up when she entered, their eyes wide and shadowed. "I'm sorry I'm late," Eliza said, forcing a cheerfulness she did not feel. "Let's get a fire going." She noticed that the McCrae children, a brother and sister with hair the color of straw, were shivering violently. Their coats were little more than rags stitched together. After the lesson, when the other children had scattered into the dusk, Eliza walked the McCrae children home, carrying the youngest one who was coughing with a deep, rattling sound. The McCrae homestead was a sod house, dug halfway into the earth to escape the wind. Inside, it was dark and smelled of boiled cabbage and sickness. Sarah McCrae, the mother, looked 10 years older than her 30 years, her hands cracked and bleeding from the dry air. "Miss Hart," Sarah said, wiping her hands on her apron, "you shouldn't have walked them all this way." "I wanted to make sure they got home warm," Eliza said. John McCrae, the father, sat at the table, his head in his hands. He looked up, his eyes hollow. "Warmth is hard to come by." "Miss Hart," he said bitterly. Is there anything you need?" Eliza asked gently. John laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "We need a miracle, or we need your Mr. Avery to have a heart." Eliza stiffened. "What do you mean? He was here yesterday, before the storm," Sarah said quietly, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder. "He told us if we miss the payment on the 1st of the month, he's foreclosing. He says the bank can't carry dead weight. But the harvest was poor." Eliza said, "Everyone knows that." "He don't care," John said. "He wants the land. It sits right on the creek. The only water for 5 miles. He says it's business. I say it's thievery. We broke this land. Miss Hart, we pulled the rocks out with our bare hands, and he's going to take it for a signature on a piece of paper." Eliza looked at the dirt floor, at the meager fire, at the fear in their eyes. She thought of Thomas's fine coat, the velvet collar, the way he spoke of the West as a ledger to be balanced. A cold knot of revulsion formed in her throat. "I will speak to him," Eliza promised, though she knew, even as she said it, that her voice carried no weight. 20 miles to the north, Cole Maddox was riding the fence line. The Blackridge Ranch was a sprawling empire of barbed wire and frozen grass. The wind out here was a living thing, screaming across the open range, driving snow into the creases of his clothing. He was working with a small crew of 3 other hands, digging out cattle that had drifted into the ravines during the storm. It was brutal, back-breaking work. They had to rope the steers, drag them out of the deep powder, and drive them toward the hay drops. That night, they made camp in the shelter of a limestone bluff. The fire hissed as snowflakes melted into the flames. They drank coffee that was thick enough to chew and ate salt pork. The foreman, a man named Silas with eyes like flint, spat into the fire. "Old man Blackridge is happy today." Silas muttered. "Why's that?" asked a young cowboy named Jim. "'Cause of the storm," Silas said. "Storm kills the weak stock, and it breaks the nesters." Cole looked up from his coffee. "The nesters?" "The homesteaders," Silas clarified. "Blackridge was talking to that banker fella, Avery. They figure this winter will finish off half the sodbusters between here and the river. Avery squeezes them with the loans. The weather kills their desire, and Blackridge swoops in and buys the deeds for pennies on the dollar." Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "Is that a fact? It's business." "Cole," Silas said, grinning. "We need the range. Cattle can't eat fences. Those farmers are just in the way." Cole stared into the flames. He remembered his brother, Ben. Ben had been 18, full of big ideas about farming a patch of dirt in Kansas. He had built a fence to keep the cattle out of his corn. The cattleman had cut the fence. Ben had put it back up. Then they had come at night with torches. Ben had run out with a shotgun he didn't know how to use. They shot him in the back. It had been labeled an accident, a property dispute. Cole had drifted ever since, moving away from the grave, away from the memory of Ben's blood on the corn stalks. But the West was a small place. The same story was being written here, just with different names. Thomas Avery, Harlan Blackridge. He thought of Eliza Hart. He thought of her pale face in the lantern light, the way she had looked at him, not as a hired hand, but as a man. He thought of the bruise he had seen forming on her arm, where Avery had grabbed her. "Avery's a son of a bitch," Cole said quietly. Silas laughed. "He's the man with the money. Cole, that makes him the law. You'd do best to remember that, especially after your little escapade with his woman." Cole stood up abruptly, tossing the dregs of his coffee into the snow. "She ain't his property." "Silas." Silas stopped laughing. He looked at Cole, his eyes narrowing. "Watch yourself. Maddox, you're a good hand. Don't go getting soft over a skirt that's already bought and paid for." Cole walked away from the fire, out into the dark. He looked toward the south, toward the town lights that were hidden by the curve of the earth. He felt an echo of the old rage, the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a war he hadn't asked for, but one he couldn't walk away from. The Christmas social was held in the church basement 2 weeks later. It was meant to be the highlight of the winter season, a night of civility in the savage cold. The room was decorated with pine boughs that smelled sharp and clean, and lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm, golden glow over the rough-hewn floorboards. Eliza stood near the punch bowl, feeling like an imposter in her own life. She wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had altered herself, taking in the waist and adding a bit of lace to the collar to hide the wear. It was simple, far simpler than the silk gowns of the merchants' wives, but the color made her eyes look striking, like deep water. Thomas stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her elbow. He was charming tonight, greeting the town's elite with a smile that showed too many teeth. He had forgiven her, or rather, he had decided to ignore her transgression as long as she played the part of the dutiful ornament. "Smile. Eliza," he whispered, leaning close. "Mr. Blackridge is looking this way." Eliza forced a smile. Across the room, Harlan Blackridge, a massive man with a beard like white wire, nodded at them. He looked like a patriarch from the Old Testament, if the patriarchs had been concerned with interest rates and barbed wire. Then the door opened, and a group of ranch hands filed in. They stayed near the back, looking uncomfortable in their Sunday best, holding their hats in their hands. They were there on sufferance, allowed in to fill out the dance cards and drink the non-alcoholic punch. Eliza felt a pull, a magnetic tug that turned her head before her mind could catch up. Cole was there. He was leaning against the back wall, dressed in a dark jacket and a clean shirt, his hair slicked back. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes scanning the room with the wariness of a wolf in a parlor. Then his gaze found hers. The room seemed to tilt, the noise of the fiddle tuning up, the chatter of the women, the clinking of cups. It all faded into a dull hum. Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat. He looked steady. He looked real. Amidst the posturing and the fake smiles, he was the only thing in the room that felt true. Thomas didn't notice. He was too busy laughing at a joke made by the mayor. Excuse me, my dear, Thomas said, patting her hand. Mr. Blackridge is waving me over. Business never sleeps, even for Christmas. Stay here. Look pleasant. Thomas walked away, leaving her standing alone by the punch bowl. The fiddler struck up a tune, a slow, mournful waltz that seemed at odds with the festive greenery. Couples began to drift onto the floor. Eliza watched the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood to keep her heart from hammering out of her chest. May I? The voice was low, familiar, and it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty door. She looked up. Cole was standing in front of her. Up close, he smelled of soap and cold air and horses. His hand was extended, palm up. It was a rough hand, scarred and calloused, a working man's hand. Eliza looked around. Thomas was deep in conversation with Blackridge in the corner. The town ladies were watching, their whispers already starting like the hiss of steam. She didn't care. Yes, she whispered. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm. He led her onto the floor, not with the jerky, obligatory movements Thomas used, but with a surprising grace. He placed one hand on her waist, through the fabric of her dress. She felt the heat of his palm. She rested her hand on his shoulder. They began to move. They danced in close, careful circles. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The conversation was happening in the points of contact, her hand in his hand on her waist, the way their bodies swayed in unison. Eliza felt a rush of adrenaline, a heightening of her senses. She saw the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. She saw the pulse beating in his throat. You shouldn't be doing this, Cole murmured, his voice barely audible over the music. Neither should you, Eliza replied, looking up at him. I'm not known for doing what I should, he said. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, softening the scar on his jaw. For a moment, the town disappeared. The judgment, the debts, the cold room behind the dress shop. It all vanished. There was only the music and the man holding her as if she were something precious, something to be protected, not owned. Eliza felt more alive in those 3 minutes than she had in the months since she had left the East. She felt seen. The music ended. They stood there for a heartbeat too long, their hands lingering. Well, the word was dropped like a stone between them. Thomas Avery was back. He stood a few feet away, his face a mask of polite disdain, but his eyes were hard as flint. I believe you have had your turn, Mr. Maddox, Thomas said. He stepped between them, effectively severing the connection. You cowboys always do struggle with boundaries, don't you? Cole took a step back. His face closed down instantly. The openness, the warmth. It snapped shut behind a shield of indifference. He became the drifter again, the hired hand. Just being polite, Mr. Avery, Cole said. Thomas smirked. Of course. Now, run along. I believe the punch bowl needs guarding. Cole looked at Eliza one last time. His eyes were unreadable, but his jaw was clenched tight. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and turned on his heel. Walking out of the church into the night, Eliza stood frozen, her hand still tingling where he had held it. Thomas took her arm, his grip firm. You are making a spectacle of yourself. Eliza, he whispered harshly in her ear. Dancing with a stray. Have you no pride? I have plenty. Thomas, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. Do you? Thomas ignored her, pulling her toward the mayor's wife. Smile. Eliza, we have a position to maintain. That night, Eliza lay awake in her narrow bed. The wind had picked up again, rattling the window pane, a lonely, hollow sound. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the waltz in her mind. She could still feel the pressure of Cole's hand on the small of her back. It was a phantom touch, burning through her nightgown. She turned over, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Thomas offered safety. He offered a brick house and a life where she would never be hungry or cold. He offered the end of the struggle that had killed her brother. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see the brick house. She saw a line cabin in the snow. She saw a man who had ridden into a blizzard for her. She felt a warmth that frightened her because it wasn't just physical. It was an awakening of a part of her soul she thought had died in the factory. She was torn between the safety she needed and the fire she suddenly, desperately wanted. And as the wind howled outside, Eliza realized with a terrified certainty that safety might not be enough anymore. January settled over the high plains not as a season, but as a siege. The snow that had fallen in November did not melt. It hardened into a gray, iron-like crust that crunched loudly under boot soles and cut the fetlocks of horses. The sky lowered itself, hanging just above the chimney tops, a ceaseless expanse of slate that promised nothing but more cold. It pressed down on the town and the scattered homesteads like a physical weight, grinding the spirit out of anything that tried to stand tall. Eliza Hart pulled her scarf tighter around her face as she trudged along the frozen ruts of the wagon track leading away from the schoolhouse. Her breath puffed out in short, white clouds that were snatched away instantly by the wind. She had stayed late to help Mrs. Gable's youngest daughter with her letters, but her mind remained fixed on the hollow faces she had seen earlier that day. The homesteaders were starving. It was not a figure of speech. She had seen the empty flour sacks flattened and pinned over drafty window frames. She had seen the ribs of the few remaining milk cows standing like skeletons in the lee of the sod barns. Mothers she spoke to, women with hands cracked and bleeding from the dry cold, no longer made small talk about the weather. They looked at Eliza with eyes that held a silent, terrifying plea, begging for help with debts she had no power to forgive. When she reached the main street, the wind was whipping dust and ice crystals against the storefronts. She hurried toward the bank, intending to tell Thomas she had returned safely, a requirement he had instituted since the storm. As she entered the warm, polished interior of the bank, the silence of the lobby was broken by raised voices coming from Thomas's private office. The door was slightly ajar. "I am telling you, Harlan, the risk is becoming unmanageable," Thomas's voice said, sharp and strained. "We are carrying too much bad paper. If the thaw doesn't bring a miracle, half these notes will default." "Good." A deeper, gravelly voice rumbled. "Harlan Blackridge." Eliza froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "It is not good for my liquidity." Thomas snapped. "I have investors in the East who expect returns, not foreclosed dirt shacks. You're thinking small." "Avery," Blackridge said, the sound of a heavy boot hitting the floorboards echoing. "That is your problem. You look at the quarterly return. I look at the range. When they default, who holds the deed?" "You do," Thomas said. "Or rather, the bank does. Until you buy the note." "Exactly," Blackridge said. "And I will buy them, for 10 cents on the dollar." "You clear your books, keep your investors happy with the volume, and I sweep the board. I want the water rights on the creek, Thomas, all of them, the McCraes, the Ellises, the whole lot. Let them starve. It makes them easier to move." Eliza pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling treasonously. Both men turned. Thomas was standing behind his massive oak desk, his face flushed. Harlan Blackridge was seated in a leather chair, a cigar clamped between his teeth, looking like a mountain carved from granite. "Eliza," Thomas said, smoothing his waistcoat. "I did not hear you come in." "I assume not," Eliza said, her voice trembling slightly. She stepped into the room. On the desk, spread out between them, was a large map of the territory. It was detailed, showing the river, the rail line, and the grid of land claims. Dozens of small squares, the homestead plots, were circled in heavy red ink. They looked like wounds on the paper. Beside the map lay a stack of ledgers, bound in black leather, containing the names and debts of the families she saw every day. Thomas saw where she was looking and quickly closed the top ledger. "We are discussing business, my dear," Thomas said, his tone shifting to that patronizing smoothness she had come to loathe. "It is not interesting for you. Is it business to plan for people to starve?" Eliza asked, looking from Thomas to Blackridge. "I heard you. You want them to fail?" Blackridge chuckled, a dry sound like shifting gravel. He stood up, towering over her. "The girl has ears. Avery." Thomas rounded the desk, taking Eliza's arm and steering her away from the map. "You are misunderstanding. Eliza, we're discussing the realities of the market. These people, they were never going to make it. The land is too hard for small operations. We are simply managing the inevitable." "You are forcing the inevitable," Eliza said, pulling her arm away. "The McCraes are good people. They have worked that land for 3 years. If you gave them an extension until spring—" "There are no extensions," Thomas snapped, his patience fraying. "This is a bank, Eliza, not a charity ward. I have been more than generous." He took a breath, composing himself, and placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was heavy, possessive. "Stop worrying about things you do not understand," he said softly. "These are ugly necessities. Once we are married, you will not need to concern yourself with money or land or these people. You will be safe. You will be provided for. That is all you need to know." Eliza looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the fear behind his eyes, the fear of his investors, the fear of losing his status, and she saw the cruelty that fear produced. "I understand more than you think. Thomas," she whispered. She turned and walked out, ignoring his call to wait. Outside, the cold air hit her like a slap, but she welcomed it. She felt dirty. She felt complicit. Every dress she wore, every meal she ate, was paid for by the machinery that was grinding the McCraes and the Ellises into dust. The West had promised freedom, vast and open, but it was shrinking into a cage just as small and merciless as the factory floor back east. 5 miles out on the flats, the wind was doing its best to knock Cole Maddox out of his saddle. He pulled his hat brim lower, squinting against the grit. He was part of a crew of 4 men sent out by Blackridge's foreman, a man named Silas who enjoyed his work a little too much. Their orders were simple: drive a new drift fence. The problem was where the fence was going. "Silas," Cole shouted over the wind, reining his horse in. "This cuts right across the creek access. That is the point." "Maddox," Silas yelled back, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that froze before it hit the ground. "Mister, Blackridge wants the line straight. It cuts off the McCrae place from the water," Cole argued. "They have cattle too." "You fence this. Their stock dies of thirst before February. Not our cattle, not our problem," Silas said, turning his horse. "Get your hammer. Maddox, we have posts to set." Cole sat on his horse, watching the crew unload the cedar posts from the wagon. A few hundred yards away, near the small sod house that belonged to the McCrae family, a child was standing by the existing garden fence. It was a little girl, no more than 6, wrapped in a blanket that dragged in the mud. She was watching the men destroy the boundary of her world. She wasn't moving. She was just crying, silent, heaving sobs that Cole could see even from this distance. He felt a twisting in his gut, a sick familiarity. He remembered his brother Ben standing in a cornfield, holding a shotgun that shook in his hands, watching men cut his wire. Cole dismounted and walked over to Silas, who was driving a post into the half-frozen earth. "I am not doing this." "Silas," Cole said quietly. Silas stopped hammering. He leaned on the maul, looking Cole up and down. "You are paid to ride and you are paid to build," Silas said. "You ain't paid to think." "It isn't right," Cole said. "Right," Silas laughed. "You think the bank cares about right? You think the winner cares? There is only strong and weak out here, Cole, and right now, you are acting weak." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menace. "You got nowhere else to go. Boy, you got no family. You got a reputation that is already hanging by a thread after that stunt with the banker's girl. You walk away from this, and you starve with them. Now pick up a hammer." Cole looked at the hammer lying in the snow. He looked at the crying girl. He picked up the hammer. But as he drove the staples into the wood, securing the barbed wire that would choke the life out of the homestead, he felt something hard and cold settle in his chest, heavier than the iron in his hand. 2 nights later, the sky to the west turned a bruised, angry orange. The alarm was raised by the church bell, clanging frantically in the darkness. "Fire!" Eliza ran out of the dress shop, clutching her shawl. On the horizon, a pillar of flame was twisting up into the black sky, throwing sparks that looked like demonic fireflies against the snow. It was the McCrae place. By the time she found a ride on a neighbor's wagon and reached the homestead, the scene was chaos. The barn, a structure of timber and sod, was a roaring inferno. The heat was intense, melting the snow in a 20-foot circle, turning the ground to a slurry of mud and ice. Men were shouting, forming a bucket line from the creek, but it was hopeless. The fire was too hot, the wind too strong. Eliza saw Cole. He was blackened with soot, his coat singed, wrestling a terrified plow horse away from the collapsing structure. He slapped the animal on the rump, sending it galloping into the dark, then turned back toward the heat. "No!" Eliza screamed, though he couldn't hear her. He didn't go back in. The roof groaned and collapsed with a shower of sparks that hissed as they hit the snow. Eliza found Mrs. McCrae huddled near the house, clutching her children. They were screaming. On the ground nearby, John McCrae lay groaning, his leg and arm wrapped in makeshift bandages that were already soaking through with blood. He had tried to save the milk cow. He had failed. Eliza fell to her knees, distributing the wool blankets she had brought, wrapping them around the shivering children. It was them. Mrs. McCrae was sobbing, rocking back and forth. "I saw riders. I saw torches. They did this." The fire burned itself out an hour later, leaving only the glowing skeleton of the barn and the stench of wet ash. The crowd began to disperse, muttering. Some were angry, but most were afraid. The message was clear. In the confusion, Eliza wandered behind the smoking ruin of the barn, needing to escape the sound of Mrs. McCrae's weeping. The air was thick with acrid smoke. She almost bumped into him. Cole was leaning against the remains of a fence post, wiping his face with a rag. He looked exhausted. His eyebrows were singed, and his face was streaked with black soot and sweat. "Cole," Eliza breathed. He looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and stark white in his blackened face. "You shouldn't be here." "Eliza," he rasped. Eliza shook her head, ignoring the warning. The anger and grief that had been building inside her for weeks finally cracked the dam. "I heard them. Cole," she said, her voice shaking. "In the office, Thomas and Blackridge. They planned this. Maybe not the fire, but they wanted this to happen. They want the land." Cole nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. "I know. I helped build the fence that boxed them in 2 days ago." The confession hung between them. Eliza stepped closer, heedless of the mud. "How can you stand it?" she whispered fiercely. "How can you work for them? I eat because of them," Cole said flatly. But his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "It is evil. Cole, Thomas, he thinks it is just numbers. But look at this." She gestured to the smoking ruins. "This is a man's life." "I know," Cole snapped, his voice cracking. He took a step toward her, dropping the rag. The intensity coming off him was hotter than the dying fire. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't see my brother every time I look at John McCrae?" He stopped, breathing hard. He looked down at her, and his expression crumbled from anger into a desperate, raw fatigue. "Men like Blackridge, men like Avery, they don't stop. Eliza, not unless someone makes them stop. And I am just one man with a saddle and $20 to my name." Eliza looked up at him. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, highlighting the scar. He looked broken, and dangerous, and beautiful. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his arm. "Cole." He looked at her hand, then up at her eyes. The air between them seemed to vanish. He reached up, his hand hovering for a second before he brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was rough, but incredibly gentle. It was intimate. It was a claim. Eliza's breath hitched. She leaned into his hand, just for a fraction of a second, feeling the warmth of his skin against the cold night. Then the reality of where they were rushed back in. The sound of voices, the ring on her finger, the danger. She pulled back, gasping as if surfacing from deep water. "I can't," she whispered. "It isn't safe. If Thomas saw us, if anyone saw us." Cole let his hand drop. The pain in his eyes was naked and searing. He nodded. "Go back to town. Eliza," he said softly. "Go back to your warm room." He stepped away, fading back into the smoke and the darkness. But the distance between them felt fake. It felt like a lie. Eliza stood alone in the ashes, her cheek still burning where he had touched her, knowing that she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. 3 days later, the snow began to fall again, soft and deceptive. At the Black Ridge Ranch, the mood was tense. The fire had spooked the other hands. They knew the difference between hard work and murder, and burning a man out felt a lot like murder. Silas called Cole out of the bunkhouse mid-morning. "Saddle up." "Maddox," Silas said, checking the cylinder of his revolver. "Where are we going?" Cole asked. "The Ellis place," Silas said. "Old man Ellis is being stubborn. He tore down a section of the new fence. Mr. Blackridge wants us to go down there and encourage him to vacate." "Encourage him how?" Cole asked, his voice low. Silas smirked. "We act scary. We break a few windows, maybe rough him up a little if he pulls a gun. Just make him understand that the climate isn't healthy for him anymore." Cole looked at the other men. They were looking at their boots. "No," Cole said. Silas paused. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Cole repeated. Louder this time. "I am done, Silas. I ain't terrorizing families." Silas turned fully, his hand resting near his gun. "You are refusing an order?" "I am refusing to be a hired thug," Cole said. "You are disloyal. Maddox, that is what you are. A bite the hand that feeds you dog." Cole felt a calm wash over him. It was the calm of a man who had nothing left to lose. He reached down and unbuckled his chaps. He dropped them in the snow. He took the coiled rope from his saddle and threw it down on top of them. "I quit," Cole said. Silas laughed. A sharp, barking sound. "You can't quit. You owe the company store for your gear. You walk off this ranch, you walk off with nothing, no wages, no reference. And I will make sure every foreman from here to Montana knows you are unreliable." "Keep the wages," Cole said. He turned and walked toward the bunkhouse to get his bedroll. "You walk away, Maddox, and you are fair game," Silas shouted after him. "You hear me? You are nobody." Cole didn't look back. He packed his meager belongings, a spare shirt, a box of cartridges, a tin of coffee, and threw his saddle on Rooster. He rode out under the main gate, the Black Ridge brand burning above him, and headed toward the only place he couldn't go, town. The news beat him there. By the time Cole reached the livery stable on the edge of town, the whispers were already circulating. Cole Maddox had gone rogue. Cole Maddox was trouble. Thomas Avery heard it from a teller. He went straight to the dress shop. He found Eliza in the back, sorting buttons. "I want you to listen to me." "Eliza," Thomas said, closing the door and locking it. Eliza looked up, startled. "What is it?" "That cowboy, Maddox. He has been fired from the Black Ridge Ranch. For insubordination." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Is he all right?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "That is not the concern. The man is dangerous. Eliza, he is desperate. I have heard he threatened the foreman. I am forbidding you, absolutely forbidding you to go near him. If you see him on the street, you cross to the other side. Do you understand? Men like that, when they fall, they try to drag decent people down with them." Eliza nodded, looking down at the buttons. "I understand. Thomas, good. I have to go to a meeting. Stay inside tonight." Thomas left. Eliza waited exactly 2 minutes. Then she grabbed her cloak and ran out the back door. The sun was setting, bleeding a dull, watery red into the gray horizon. The temperature was plummeting again. Eliza found him at the livery stable. He was tightening the cinch on his saddle, his breath coming in white plumes. His horse looked tired. Cole looked worse. He froze when he saw her standing in the opening of the stable doors. "I told you to stay away," he said, not turning to face her. "Where are you going?" Eliza asked, stepping into the smell of hay and manure. "Does it matter?" Cole asked. "South, maybe, or further west, somewhere the wind don't blow so hard." "You're running," Eliza said. "Again." Cole spun around. His eyes were blazing. "And what would you have me do?" "Eliza, stay here? Starve? I have no job. I have no bunk. I have a powerful man who wants me dead and a town that thinks I'm trash." "You could stay and fight," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "Fight with what?" Cole demanded, stepping closer. "With my fists against their money? Against the law? You don't know how this works. The house always wins." "Eliza, always. I know how it works," Eliza shouted back. "I lived in a factory where they owned the air we breathed. I know what it is to be crushed." "Then why are you still with him?" Cole asked. His voice dropped to a whisper, lethal and quiet. "Why do you let him touch you?" Eliza flinched as if he had slapped her. "Because I am afraid," she confessed, the words tearing out of her throat. "Because I remember being hungry. Cole, I remember watching my brother cough blood because we were poor. Thomas is safe. He has a wall against the cold." "Is he?" Cole asked. He stepped into her space. She didn't retreat. "He is the cold. Eliza, he is the ice." He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. She could see the gold flecks in his eyes, the roughness of his skin, the desperation that mirrored her own. "Don't go," she whispered. "Please, don't disappear without a word." Cole stared at her. His hands came up, hovering at her waist, trembling. He wanted to grab her. She could feel the heat of him, the sheer, overwhelming pull of his body. She leaned in, her breath trembling against the hollow of his neck. For a second, the world narrowed down to the space between their lips. It would be so easy. Just one step, just one surrender. But Cole closed his eyes. He shuddered, a long, racking breath. Then he stepped back. He forced himself away from her. "I can't stay here, Eliza," he said, his voice rough. "And I can't take you with me, not to the life I have." He turned back to his horse. He swung into the saddle. "If you ever need me, look to the high country," he said. "There is an old shack in the foothills, the line shack we used. I'll be there for a day or two before I move on." He didn't say goodbye. He kicked the horse into a trot and rode out into the freezing dusk, vanishing into the shadows of the hills. Eliza stood in the empty stable. She felt hollowed out. She felt a phantom warmth on her waist where his hands had almost been. She walked back to her room behind the dress shop. She sat on her bed in the dark. She heard the wind rising again. She thought of Thomas and his ledgers. She thought of the red circles on the map. She thought of Cole riding alone into the night. She realized then that the numbness she had cultivated, the careful survival instinct that had brought her west, had cracked. It was broken, and something wild, something dangerous and absolutely necessary, was growing in the fracture. She wasn't just afraid of the cold anymore. She was afraid of living a life without the fire. February arrived with the subtlety of a hammer blow. The wind did not simply blow, it screamed, tearing across the high plains with a violence that rattled the very teeth in a man's head. It was in this biting gale that the notices appeared. They fluttered on the rough-hewn doors of the homestead shacks like white flags of surrender. Though they demanded the opposite, they were legal eviction notices, bearing the heavy, embossed seal of the territorial court and the cramping signature of the county clerk, pinned there like accusations against people whose only crime was poverty. Thomas Avery and Harlan Blackridge had stopped pretending. The mask of benevolence had slipped, revealing the iron machinery of commerce beneath. The notices stated that due to failure to meet loan repayments, the properties were subject to immediate seizure for families who were already boiling leather harnesses to make soup. The paper on the door was a death sentence. Most of the homesteaders huddled inside, paralyzed by fear and the freezing cold. But Mr. Ellis, a man with a back bent like a twisted juniper root from 40 years of labor, tore the notice from his door. He walked into town, his boots held together with twine, and shouted at the brick facade of the bank until his voice gave out. He refused to leave. He swore he would hold his ground until the thaw. 3 nights later, Mr. Ellis was dead. He was found at dawn near his corral, his body frozen into a grotesque shape against the snow. He had been shot once in the chest. The snow around him was stained a dark, shocking crimson that looked black in the early light. The sheriff, a man named Miller, whose eyes always darted to the side when he spoke, called it a robbery gone wrong. He claimed drifters had likely seen Ellis's horse and panicked, but the town knew. The silence in the mercantile and the saloon was heavy with the truth. Robbers did not leave a horse standing. Robbers did not leave a man's boots on his feet. This was an execution. Cole Maddox sat in the common room of Mrs. Higgins' boarding house, a drafty clapboard structure on the edge of town where he had rented a room after leaving the ranch. The room smelled of boiled cabbage and wet wool. He was staring into a cup of cold coffee when he heard voices from the hallway. It was 2 cowboys from the Blackridge outfit. Men he had ridden with, men he had shared beans with. They were drunk, their voices slurring. "Did you see how he fell?" One of them laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, folded up like a wet sack. "Shut your mouth," the other hissed. "You want the whole house to know?" "Let them know," the first man said. "Might teach the rest of them to read the signs." Blackridge pays for results, not patience. Cole griped the tin cup so hard the metal bent under his thumb. The guilt was a physical thing, a rat gnawing at his stomach. He had built the fences. He had ridden the lines. He had taken Blackridge's coin. He felt the blood of Mr. Ellis on his own hands, invisible and burning. He stood up, intending to go into the hall and beat the men until they couldn't stand. But he stopped at the door. Violence would only land him in a cell. And from a cell, he could do nothing. He sat back down, the rage vibrating in his bones. In the warm, lamp-lit office of the bank, the air smelled of beeswax and expensive tobacco. Thomas Avery placed a stack of heavy cream envelopes on the desk in front of Eliza. "We must send these out by the end of the week," Thomas said, dipping a pen into the inkwell and offering it to her. "What are they?" Eliza asked, her voice dull. "Invitations, my dear, for our engagement party. We will host it at the hotel ballroom next month. Mr. Blackridge has kindly offered to cover the catering. It will be the event of the season." Eliza looked at the cards. The calligraphy was elegant, swirling and looping. "The honor of your presence is requested at the engagement of Miss Eliza Hart to Mr. Thomas Avery. Mr. Ellis is dead." "Thomas," Eliza said, not taking the pen. Thomas sighed, a sound of exaggerated patience. "Yes, a tragedy. The territory is a dangerous place. That is why I am trying to secure a future for us." "He was shot," Eliza said, looking up at him. "He was robbed," Thomas corrected sharply. "It is unfortunate, but life continues. Eliza, commerce continues. Now, please, sign the cards. I want people to see that we are moving forward." Eliza took the pen. Her hand felt heavy, as if the ink were lead. As she wrote her name on the first card, she felt a sickening sensation of finality. She was not signing an invitation. She was signing a confession. She was writing her name on the door of a cage, and Thomas was holding the key. She attended the wake 2 days later. It was held in the Ellis cabin, a single room with a dirt floor. The widow, Mary Ellis, sat in a rocking chair that didn't rock, staring at the wall with eyes that saw nothing. Her 3 children clung to one another near the stove, silent and terrified. The other women of the town moved around them, murmuring platitudes, offering casseroles that would not bring the dead back. Eliza stood in the corner, feeling like an intruder. She wore the coat Thomas had bought her. She had eaten a full breakfast. She was engaged to the man who held the mortgage on this house of mourning. Something inside her, a tension that had been pulling tight since the first blizzard, finally snapped. The silence of the widow was louder than any scream. It was an indictment. Eliza realized she could not be neutral. There was no middle ground in a war between the starving and the gluttonous. She left the wake early, slipping out into the biting cold. She did not go back to the dress shop. She did not go to the bank. She walked toward the one place Thomas had forbidden her to go. The Golden Steer was a small, smoky saloon on the wrong end of town, a place where sawdust covered the bloodstains on the floor and the whiskey tasted like kerosene. Eliza pushed through the swinging doors, ignoring the sudden silence that fell over the room. She saw him immediately. Cole was sitting at a table in the back, alone. A bottle stood before him, mostly full. He was staring at the amber liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Cole," she said, her voice cutting through the haze of tobacco smoke. He looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion. He didn't look surprised to see her. He just looked tired. "You shouldn't be here, Eliza," he said, his voice rough. "Come outside," she said, "please." She turned and walked out without waiting to see if he followed. She stood in the alleyway beside the saloon, where the wind whipped the snow into small, spinning devils. Above, the sky was a bleak tapestry of faint stars and a thin, sharp moon that looked like a paring knife. The door creaked open, and Cole stepped out. He didn't have his coat. He stood in his shirt sleeves, oblivious to the freezing air. "What do you want, Eliza?" he asked. "Avery will have my hide if he knows I am talking to you. Mister." "Ellis didn't die in a robbery," Eliza said, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. "I know," Cole said. "Thomas and Blackridge. They are pushing everyone. I heard Thomas. He talks about the homesteaders like they are cattle to be culled. He wants the water rights. He wants it all." "I know," Cole repeated. "How can you just stand there?" Eliza cried, stepping toward him. "You know what they are doing. You worked for them." "And what do you want me to do?" Cole shouted back, the sudden volume of his voice making her jump. "You want me to ride down Main Street with guns blazing? You want me to get shot down like Ellis? I want you to care," Eliza yelled. Cole slammed his hand against the rough wood of the saloon wall. "I care. You think I don't care?" He took a jagged breath, the anger draining out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving him hollow. "My brother died like Ellis," he said quietly. "Ben, he was 19. He wouldn't sell his claim to a cattle baron in Kansas. They caught him at the fence line, shot him in the back." Eliza froze. The wind howled around the corner of the building, but the space between them felt suddenly still. "I found him," Cole continued, his voice void of emotion. "I was the one who found him." "And do you know what the law said?" "They said it was a dispute between parties. They said there was no evidence. The man who ordered it is a senator now." He looked at Eliza, and she saw the wreckage in his face. The scar on his jaw was just surface damage. The real scars were deep, jagged things wrapped around his heart. He was a man who had learned that justice was a fairy tale, told to children to keep them quiet. The past pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating. Eliza realized then that his silence wasn't indifference. It was a dam holding back a tidal wave of grief. "I can't marry him," Eliza whispered. The confession hung in the frozen air. Cole looked at her, his gaze intense. "Eliza, you have to. It is the only way you survive this." "I can't," she said, shaking her head violently. "He makes me sick. Cole, every time he touches my arm, I feel like I am being sold. I feel like I am suffocating. I would rather freeze out here with nothing than live in that brick house knowing it was built on bodies." "You don't know what you are saying," Cole said, stepping closer. "You don't know what it is to have nothing. I know what it is to be empty," Eliza cried. "And I know that when I am with him, I am dead. And when I am with you—" She stopped. The truth was out, naked and terrifying. Cole stared at her. The rigidity in his shoulders broke. He looked at her not as the banker's fiancée, not as a lady to be protected, but as a woman who was drowning in the same dark water as he was. "Eliza," he groaned, a sound that was half prayer, half curse. The distance between them vanished. It wasn't a decision. It was a collision. They stepped into each other's arms with a desperation that bordered on violence. Cole's hands tangled in her hair, pulling her face to his. Eliza gripped the front of his shirt, her fingers digging into the fabric as if to tear it. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was fierce. It was the taste of whiskey and winter and salt. It was the shock of warmth in a world that had been frozen for months. Eliza felt his beard rasp against her chin, felt the hard pressure of his mouth, and a sound escaped her throat, a sob of relief. He held her as if he were afraid she would turn to smoke and vanish in the wind. She felt the erratic, thundering beat of his heart against her chest, matching her own. For a moment, there was no bank, no debt, no murder. There was only this, the heat of him, the smell of him, the undeniable, terrifying fact that she belonged to him. They pulled apart, gasping, their breath mingling in a single white cloud. Cole rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, his touch trembling. "God help us. Eliza," he whispered. Eliza opened her eyes. She looked at him, and she knew. There was no going back. The engagement cards, the house on the hill, the safety, it was all ash. "I don't care," she whispered. "I don't care about any of it." But Cole pulled back further, his eyes darkening with fear. "I do. If Avery finds out, if Blackridge finds out, they will destroy you. Eliza, they will leave you with nothing. They can't take this," she said fiercely. "They can take your life," Cole said grimly. "Go home, Eliza, before someone sees us." He turned and walked back into the saloon, leaving her alone in the alley. But the taste of him was still on her lips, and the fire he had lit in her blood was burning hot enough to keep the winter at bay. The escalation was swift. 2 days later, Eliza was at the schoolhouse. It was late afternoon, and the light was failing. She was banking the fire when she heard shouting outside. She ran to the window. 3 men on horseback, Blackridge's hired guns, were circling the yard. They were taunting the older boys who were chopping wood. "Get off the land," one of the gunmen shouted, waving a pistol. "School's closed." Eliza threw open the door. "Stop it," she screamed. "Leave them alone." The gunman laughed, wheeling his horse. "Look at the school marm. You got a lesson for us, darling." Suddenly, a rider burst from the tree line. It was Cole. He had been nearby, likely watching over the schoolhouse as he had been doing quietly for days. He rode Rooster hard, putting himself between the children and the gunman. "Back off. Dyson," Cole shouted, his hand hovering near the revolver at his hip. "These are kids." "Cole Maddox," the gunman sneered. "The traitor. We were just having some fun." "Fun's over," Cole said. "Right on." The gunman named Dyson raised his pistol. It happened in a blur. A shot rang out, cracking through the cold air like a whip. Cole's horse reared. Cole didn't draw. He kept his hands visible, trying to de-escalate. But Dyson fired again, this time into the air. "He's shooting at us," Dyson yelled to his companions. A clear, staged lie. "Self-defense. Boys, they opened fire." Cole spurred his horse, zigzagging to draw their aim away from the schoolhouse. He vanished into the timber, bullets kicking up snow around him. The gunman laughed and turned back to town. By evening, the story had been written. Cole Maddox had ambushed Blackridge's men. He had fired on them near the schoolhouse, endangering the children. The sheriff, sweating in Thomas Avery's office, signed the warrant. Attempted murder. Eliza heard the news from Mrs. Gable. The sheriff was organizing a posse for the morning. They were going to hunt him down like a rabid dog. Eliza didn't think. She packed a small bag with bread, cheese, and a heavy wool blanket. She grabbed a box of matches. She ran. She found him at the edge of the settlement, near the old creek bed. He was tightening the cinch on a fresh horse he had seemingly traded for. He looked wild, his eyes darting at every shadow. "Cole!" she hissed. He spun around, gun drawn, before lowering it. "Eliza, you have to get out of here." "The sheriff is coming." "I know," she said, breathless. "Where are you going?" "Montana," he said. "Canada. Anywhere but here." "I can't stay. Eliza, they'll hang me. If you run, they will say you are guilty." Eliza grabbed his arm. "Thomas will spin it that you are a madman. You will be a fugitive for the rest of your life. I am already a fugitive. Cole snapped. No, Eliza said firmly. Not if we can prove the truth. But you can't run. The passes to the north are blocked with snow. They will catch you in the open. Then what do I do? Cole asked, desperation cracking his voice. Hide, Eliza said. Where? The old line shack, she said. The one in the foothills. Not the one we stayed in, the one further up, near the eagle's nest. I saw it when I took the children hiking in the fall. It is abandoned. No one goes up there in winter. It is too rocky for horses. It is suicide. Eliza, it is 10 degrees below zero up there. We can make it, she said. We? Cole froze. You aren't coming. I am coming, she said. No, absolutely not. I am coming. Cole! Eliza stepped into him, her face set in stone. I signed those invitations, and I felt my soul dying. I am not going back to him. I am not going back to that room. If you leave me here, I will walk out into the snow myself. Cole looked at her. He saw the resolve in her jaw, a mirror of his own. He saw that she was terrified, but that her fear of staying was greater than her fear of the wild. He grabbed her hand. It's a hard climb. He said, I'm stronger than I look, she replied. They reached the shack 3 hours later. It was a brutal climb, leading the horses as far as they could before turning them loose to find their own way back to lower pastures, erasing their trail. They scrambled over ice-slicked rocks and through deep drifts, the wind trying to peel them off the face of the mountain. The shack was little more than a pile of rotting timbers leaned against a rock face. The roof sagged. The door was missing a hinge. Inside, it smelled of ancient dust and rat droppings, but it was shelter. Cole worked frantically to chink the worst of the gaps with moss and snow. He built a fire in the crumbling stone hearth, feeding it with deadfall he had dragged in. Eliza spread the blankets on the driest part of the floor. Outside, the wind howled with the voice of 1,000 ghosts. Inside, the fire crackled, a tiny, defiant orange heart in the center of a frozen world. They ate the bread and cheese in silence, passing a canteen of water between them. The exhaustion was a heavy narcotic. Later, huddled together under the blankets for warmth, the silence broke. The isolation stripped away the last of their defenses. There was no town here, no bank, no reputation, just 2 humans clinging to the earth. Eliza lay with her head on Cole's chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. I was 17, she said softly. The words drifted up into the dark rafters. Cole's arm tightened around her. I worked in the weaving room. She continued. The foreman, his name was Mr. Grady. He controlled the shifts. He controlled who got paid. She paused, her breath hitching. He told me that if I wanted to keep my position, I had to be nice to him. I needed the money. William was sick, so I let him touch me. In the supply closet, Cole's body went rigid. A low growl vibrated in his chest. It went on for months. Eliza whispered. Then I got sick. I didn't know I was with child. I lost it. On the factory floor, there was so much blood. They fired me for ruining the textiles. No one believed me. They said I was a whore. They said I tempted him. She began to weep, silent, hot tears that soaked into Cole's shirt. That is why I came west. Cole, I thought I could wash it off. But the shame, it followed me. Thomas, he makes me feel the same way, Mr. Grady did, like I am something to be used. Cole shifted. He put his hand under her chin and lifted her face. In the dying light of the fire, his eyes were wet. Listen to me, he said, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it sounded like the earth cracking. You listen to me. You are not stained. You are not ruined. You survived. He kissed her forehead, then her eyelids, then her mouth. It wasn't your fault, he whispered against her lips. None of it. You are the bravest thing I have ever known. You are clean. Eliza, you are clean as new snow. Eliza looked at him. For the first time in 5 years, she believed it. The way he looked at her, with reverence, with pain, with love. burned the shame out of her blood. The desire that rose up then was not about survival. It was about reclaiming herself. She reached for him, pulling him down. "Make me forget," she whispered. Cole covered her body with his. The cold of the shack vanished. The world outside, the posses, the debts, the guns, ceased to exist. There was only the friction of skin, the desperate heat of their bodies, and the whispered promises that filled the dark. He moved with a gentleness that belied his strength, treating her as if she were something holy. And when she cried out, it wasn't from pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that she was finally, truly free. They lay tangled together as the fire burned down to embers. Two fugitives hiding in the rock, holding on to each other as the only solid ground in a world that was spinning apart. The morning light did not creep into the line shack. It invaded. It struck the rough-hewn timbers and the dirt floor with a brilliance that hurt the eyes, reflecting off the miles of crusty, wind-scoured snow outside. It was a harsh, white illumination that stripped away the shadows where Eliza Hart and Cole Maddox had hidden, leaving them exposed. Eliza woke first, the cold of the cabin biting at her nose despite the warmth of the man beside her. For a long time, she simply watched the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight that pierced the gap in the roof. The peace of the moment was profound, a fragile, suspended breath in the middle of a hurricane. But it was terrifying, too. In the daylight, the reality of their situation had sharp edges. They were freezing, they were hungry, and they were hunted. Cole stirred, his arm tightening around her waist before he opened his eyes. He looked at the door, his instinct for danger waking up before his body did. "We have to move," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "They will check the foothills eventually." Eliza sat up, pulling the wool blanket around her shoulders. "And go where? Cole? We cannot run forever. If we leave the territory, Blackridge wins. He takes the McCrae place. He takes the Ellis place. He wins." Cole sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. The scar on his jaw looked stark in the morning light. "Better he wins than we die. Eliza, I can hunt. We can make for the pass before another storm hits." Eliza looked at the fire. "Now just a bed of gray ash. No, if we run, we are just what they say we are. Criminals, sinners." She turned to him, her eyes bright with a sudden, dangerous resolve. "The ledgers," she said. Cole frowned. "What?" "In Thomas's office," Eliza said, the words coming faster as the idea took hold. "He keeps a separate book. I saw it when he was arguing with Blackridge. It is black leather, smaller than the others. He put it away when I walked in. And the map. The map has the dates marked on the homesteads. Red circles. Eliza," Cole warned, shaking his head. "It is proof, Cole. Proof that they are conspiring to defraud the families. Proof that they planned the foreclosures before the payments are even due. If we have that book, we have a shield. We can find a circuit judge. We can stop them." "You can't go back there," Cole said, his voice rising. "It is a trap. Avery will be watching you like a hawk." "He thinks I am stupid," Eliza countered. "He thinks I am a soft, frightened girl from the East who got lost in the snow. He does not know what I am capable of." She stood up, shaking out her skirts, her decision hardening like the ice outside. "I am going back." Cole was on his feet in an instant, grabbing her shoulders. "No, I won't let you. It is too dangerous. I cannot live like this." "Cole!" Eliza cried, pulling away. "I cannot live hiding in a hole while honest people are burned out of their homes. And I cannot live knowing I let them do it. If I don't try, then Thomas owns me anyway. He owns my fear." Cole looked at her, and the protest died in his throat. He saw the steel in her spine, the same steel that had kept her walking through a blizzard. He realized with a sinking heart that he could not stop her, not without breaking the very spirit he loved. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her so tightly it almost hurt. His hands trembled against the wool of her coat. "If you don't come back," he whispered into her hair. "I will come back," she promised, pressing her forehead against his. No matter what happens, I will come back to you." He kissed her, a desperate, searing seal on a promise that felt impossible to keep. Then he helped her saddle the horse she had ridden up, watching as she turned the animal back toward the slope, back toward the town that wanted to destroy them. Eliza rode into town just before noon. She had rehearsed her lie 100 times in the biting cold of the descent. She tied her horse at the rail behind the dress shop and slipped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mrs." Gable looked up from her sewing, her mouth dropping open. "Eliza, where on earth have you been?" "Mr. Avery has been tearing the town apart." "I was with the McCrays," Eliza said, forcing her voice to sound weary and dull. "The youngest boy took a turn for the worse. The fever was terrible. I couldn't leave him. I didn't think anyone would notice." "Notice?" "Mrs." Gable exclaimed. "The sheriff was ready to drag the river." Eliza went to her room, splashing cold water on her face to hide the flush of her nerves. She waited. She knew he would come. 10 minutes later, the door banged open. Thomas Avery stood there, his chest heaving, his face a mottled red. "You—" He pointed a shaking finger at her. "Thomas," Eliza said, sitting on the edge of her bed, looking at the floor. "I'm sorry. The child was dying. I lost track of time." "Dying?" Thomas scoffed, stepping into the room. "You disappear for 2 days because of a sick brat? Do you have any idea how this looks? Eliza, people are talking. They say you ran off. They say you are mad." "Let them talk," Eliza said softly. "I was doing a Christian duty." Thomas stared at her, searching for a crack in her story. But Eliza had learned to hide her thoughts in the factories of the East, where a wrong look could cost you a day's wages. She looked small, tired, and suitably cowed. Thomas exhaled, adjusting his cuffs. His anger shifted to his usual condescension. "You have a soft heart. Eliza, it is a weakness. It will ruin us if you do not learn to control it. I will try." "Thomas," she whispered. "I have work tonight," Thomas said, checking his pocket watch. "The end of the month is approaching. The accounts are a mess. Since you are so keen to be helpful, perhaps you can assist me. You know the ledgers. You can copy the transfer columns while I finish the correspondence." Eliza felt a jolt of electricity shoot down her spine. It was the opening she hadn't dared to pray for. "Of course, Thomas," she said, "I would be happy to help." The bank was quiet at night. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, shutting out the street, and the only light came from the kerosene lamps on the desks, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Eliza sat at a small side table, a stack of general journals in front of her. Thomas sat at his massive oak desk, scratching away with a pen. He seemed to enjoy having her there. It was a domestic scene that appealed to his vanity. His future wife, quiet and obedient, working in the shadow of his empire. Around 8 o'clock, a knock came at the back door. Thomas frowned, standing up. "That will be Blackridge," he muttered. "Stay here, Eliza. Keep working. I will take him into the conference room. This is not for your ears." He unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk, took out a thick file, and walked to the back of the building. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. Eliza stopped writing. The silence in the room was deafening. She looked at the desk. She stood up, her legs feeling like water. She moved to the desk. The drawer he had opened was locked again. But Thomas was arrogant. He often left his keys in his waistcoat pocket. But sometimes, when he was working late, he left the spare set in the ceramic bowl on the mantel. She checked the bowl. They were there. Her hands shook violently as she inserted the small brass key into the lock of the bottom drawer. It turned with a soft snick. She pulled the drawer open. There, beneath a stack of deeds, was the black leather book. She opened it. The pages were filled with Thomas's precise handwriting. It was all there. McCray. Default scheduled February 1st. Arson arranged January 15th. Value $400. Acquisition price $40. It was a catalog of crimes written in ink. Eliza reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook. She began to copy frantically. her pen scratching against the paper. She copied dates, names, and amounts. But as she wrote, she heard the murmur of voices from the back room getting louder. They were finishing. It wasn't enough. Her notes were just scribbles. They could be dismissed as her own fabrications. She needed the book. She looked at the door. She looked at the ledger. She made a choice that terrified her. She closed the black book and shoved it into her satchel, which sat on the floor by her chair. She locked the drawer and dropped the keys back into the bowl. She was back in her seat, dipping her pen into the inkwell. When Thomas walked back in, he looked flushed, triumphant. "Everything is in order," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Harlan is a difficult man, but he understands the value of aggression." He looked at her. "You look pale, Eliza. I'm tired." "Thomas," she said, closing the general journal she'd been pretending to work on. "The numbers, they blur after a while." "Go home," he said benevolently. "Rest. We have church tomorrow. I want you looking your best." Eliza stood up, slinging her satchel over her shoulder. The weight of the stolen ledger felt like a stone block against her hip. "Good night, Thomas." She walked to the front door. As she reached for the handle, the door to the clerk's cage opened. Mr. Perkins, a mousy man with spectacles who often worked late without Thomas knowing, stepped out. He looked at Eliza, then at her bag, which was bulging slightly with the shape of the book. "Miss Hart, Mr. Perkins said. Eliza froze. You have ink on your cuff," he said, pointing. Eliza looked down. A dark smear of blue stain marred the white lace of her sleeve. "Clumsy of me." She forced a laugh. "Good night, Mr. Perkins." She walked out into the freezing street, every breath puffing out before her like a cloud of steam. She didn't run, though every instinct in her body screamed at her to sprint. She walked steadily until she turned the corner, then she melted into the shadows of the alleyway, heading not for the dress shop, but for the edge of town where the darkness of the prairie began. The return to the shack was a nightmare of paranoia. Every snapping branch sounded like a rifle cocking. When she finally stumbled through the door of the cabin, Cole was waiting with a pistol in his hand. He saw her face and lowered the gun, rushing to catch her as she sagged against the doorframe. "I got it," she gasped, pulling the book from her bag. They sat by the fire. The lantern turned low and turned the pages. Cole read in silence, his face hardening into a mask of stone. "Here," he said, pointing a calloused finger at an entry. "Ellis, removal imperative. Use Dyson." "Dyson," Cole whispered. "That's the man who shot Ellis. And here, schoolhouse incident. Provocation required." "It is all here," Eliza said. "Every lie, every theft. We need a judge," Cole said, "not the local magistrate. He is in Avery's pocket. We need the circuit judge. He's due in Cheyenne Wells next week. We can't make Cheyenne Wells." Eliza said, "The horses are spent, and Thomas will know the book is gone by morning. He will send riders to every station." "Then what do we do?" Cole asked. "We take it to the people," Eliza said. "We take it to the church." "The church?" "Tomorrow is Sunday." Eliza said, "The whole town will be there. The merchants, the wives, the homesteaders, everyone. Thomas cares about his reputation more than anything. If we expose him in front of God and everyone, he can't hide it. He can't kill us in the pews. It is a gamble. Eliza, a big one. It is the only card we have," she said. The bells of the First Methodist Church rang out across the frozen valley, a clear, mournful sound calling the faithful to prayer. Inside the bank, Thomas Avery unlocked his bottom drawer to deposit the Blackridge file. He froze. He pulled the drawer wider. He shoved the papers aside, empty. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He checked the lock, unbroken. He checked the bowl. The keys were there. Eliza. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The quiet obedience. The sudden interest in his work. She had played him. She, a penniless factory girl, had played him for a fool. His face turned a dark, violent purple. He grabbed his coat and his hat. He did not go to the sheriff first. He went to the saloon, where a few of Blackridge's men were nursing their morning hangovers. "Come with me," Thomas ordered. Bring your irons. The church was full. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, beeswax candles, and the murmuring of the congregation. The homesteaders sat in the back, huddled in their coats. The merchants sat in the front, their wives displaying their Sunday bonnets. Thomas Avery stood at the front, near the altar. He looked calm, but his eyes were sharks circling in deep water. "My friends," Thomas said, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "Before Reverend Smith begins, I must share a heavy burden with you." The room went silent. "My fiancée, Eliza Hart, has been taken." A gasp rippled through the pews. "She has been seduced and corrupted by a criminal," Thomas continued, his voice trembling with manufactured grief. "Cole Maddox, the man who shot at our children. He has turned her mind. He has turned her against her own salvation. I fear she is involved in his schemes now. If you see her, do not trust her. She is not the woman we knew." The door at the back of the church creaked open. Eliza Hart stood there. She wore her dark blue wool dress and her heavy cloak. Her face was pale, but her head was high. She held a black book against her chest. "I am exactly the woman you knew." "Thomas," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in the stunned silence, it carried like a bell. Heads turned. People stared. The tension in the room spiked, sharp and sudden. "Eliza," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a chilling, soothing tone. "You are unwell. Put down the book and come here. We can help you." "No," Eliza said. She walked down the center aisle. She could feel the wooden floorboards vibrating under her boots. She could feel the heat of 100 gazes. Judgment, curiosity, fear. "I am not unwell. Thomas, I am awake." She stopped in the center of the room. She looked at the faces around her. Mrs. Gable, Mr. Perkins, the McCrays. "This town is built on a lie," Eliza said. She held up the ledger. "We sit here and pray for mercy, while the men in the front row steal the roofs over your heads." "She is hysterical," Thomas shouted, his composure cracking. "Sheriff, remove her." The sheriff stood up, but John McCray stood up too, blocking the aisle. "Let her speak," McCray rumbled. Eliza opened the book. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. October 10th, she read, "Loan to McCray. Terms altered. Interest raised to 50% upon first missed payment. Intent. Foreclosure by January." A murmur went through the back of the room. November 2nd. Eliza read louder. "Ellis property. Owner resistant. Solution. Intimidation." She looked up at the widow Ellis. February 3rd. Ellis removal completed. Payment to Dyson, $100. Mary Ellis screamed. It was a raw, animal sound of grief and realization. "Lies," Thomas yelled, stepping down from the altar. "She wrote that herself. She is covering for her lover. Is this your handwriting?" "Thomas," Eliza challenged, holding the page up. "Is this your signature?" Harlan Blackridge stood up from the front pew. He was a massive shape in his fur coat. "Enough," he growled. The room erupted. People were standing, shouting. The division was instant. The homesteaders on one side, realizing the depth of the betrayal, and the merchants on the other, unsure but frightened by the accusation. Eliza didn't stop. She read another entry, and another. The arson, the bribes to the sheriff, the calculated destruction of the valley. Blackridge pushed his way into the aisle. "Give me the book, girl." He reached for her. "Get your hands off her." The shout came from the open door. Cole Maddox stood there, framed by the bright snow outside. He held his revolver in his hand, hanging by his side. "Maddox!" someone shouted. Blackridge turned, his face twisting into a snarl. "You!" The argument spilled out of the church, a tide of angry bodies pushing through the double doors into the street. The snow had started to fall again, huge, soft flakes that swirled in the wind. Eliza was pushed out onto the boardwalk. Thomas lunged for her, trying to grab the ledger. She spun away, slipping on the ice. Blackridge was in the street. He saw his empire crumbling in the eyes of the town. He saw the way the people were looking at him, not with fear anymore, but with hate. He saw Cole Maddox walking toward him. "You ruin everything. Blackridge roared. He reached inside his heavy coat. He wasn't reaching for a ledger. Cole saw the motion. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the law or the hangman. He thought about Eliza standing in the snow. He sprinted, putting himself between Blackridge and the boardwalk. Blackridge's gun cleared his holster, a dark, ugly piece of metal. Cole brought his own gun up. The shots were almost simultaneous. Crack, crack. The sound was deafening in the cold air. Blackridge jerked back as if kicked by a mule. He spun, clutching his chest, and collapsed into the slush, the snow instantly turning pink around him. Cole staggered. He took a step back, his hand going to his side. He looked at Eliza, his eyes wide with surprise. Then his legs gave out. "Cole!" Eliza's scream tore her throat. She threw herself off the boardwalk, landing on her knees in the mud beside him. He was pale, gasping for air. Blood was soaking through his shirt, dark and hot against the snow. "No, no, no." Eliza wept, pressing her hands against the wound. The crowd stood paralyzed. The most powerful man in the territory was dead. The outlaw was dying. The sheriff stood with his gun half drawn, unsure who to shoot. "Help him!" Eliza screamed at the silent faces. "Please!" Thomas stood on the boardwalk, looking down at Blackridge's body. "It's over," he said coldly. "The criminal is down. Let him bleed." "No!" John McCrae stepped forward. He looked at Thomas, then at the sheriff. He spat on the ground. "He saved my boy's life in the fire," McCrae said. McCrae knelt beside Eliza. "Grab his legs," he shouted to another homesteader. Two other men stepped forward, men with patched coats and hard faces. They ignored the sheriff. They ignored Thomas. "We have to get him out of here," Eliza said, her hands slick with Cole's blood. "The sheriff will finish him if we stay." "We'll take him to the edge of town," McCrae said. "My wagon is there." They lifted Cole. He groaned, his head lolling back. Eliza held his hand, squeezing it until her knuckles were white. "Stay with me," she whispered. You promised you'd wait." The snow fell harder, thickening into a white curtain that began to obscure the town. The church and the body of the tyrant lying in the street. Eliza, her dress ruined, her heart breaking, walked alongside the men carrying the only thing in the world that mattered, dragging him away from the edge of death and into the teeth of the storm. The storm that descended upon the high plains that afternoon felt personal. It was not merely weather. It was a violent, screaming echo of the blizzard that had first thrown Eliza Hart and Cole Maddox together. The wind whipped the snow into a blinding frenzy, turning the world into a swirling white void where direction became a memory and survival became a question of will. John McCrae drove the wagon, hunching his shoulders against the gale, urging the plow horses forward through drifts that reached their knees. In the back, cushioned by straw and rough wool blankets, Eliza knelt beside Cole. His blood was soaking into the straw, a dark, spreading stain that terrified her more than the howling wind. "Stay with me," Eliza shouted over the roar of the storm, gripping Cole's hand. Her gloves were stained with his blood, slick and cold. "Look at me, Cole." Cole's eyes fluttered open, but they were glazed and distant. He was fading in and out of consciousness, his body shuddering with shock. "Ben," he mumbled, his voice a cracked whisper. "Ben, get down! They're shooting!" "It's not Ben," Eliza said, tears freezing on her cheeks. "It is Eliza. You are safe." "Cole, we are going to the shack. I promised," Cole rasped, his head rolling restlessly. "I promised I wouldn't let them take the land. I failed him. Eliza, I failed him." "You didn't fail anyone," Eliza cried, smoothing the damp hair back from his forehead. "You saved us. You saved everyone. Now you have to fight. Cole, do not leave me alone in this. Do not you dare leave me." The journey to the line shack, the one hidden in the foothills where they had first taken refuge as fugitives, felt like an eternity. Every jolt of the wagon made Cole groan, a sound that tore through Eliza's heart. She kept talking to him, a frantic stream of words meant to act as a lifeline, a thread connecting him to the living world. She told him about the spring that would come, about the garden they would plant, about the color of the curtains she would sew for a window that wasn't broken. When the wagon finally lurched to a halt in front of the dilapidated structure, McCrae and the other two homesteaders carried Cole inside. They laid him on the pallet near the hearth, where the embers of their previous fire were cold and dead. "Get a fire going," Eliza ordered, her voice sharp with panic. "I need light, and water, hot water." McCrae nodded, rushing to gather the wood Cole had stacked days before. Eliza knelt beside Cole. With shaking hands, she took a knife from her belt and cut open his shirt. The fabric peeled away with a wet, sucking sound. The wound was low on his side, a jagged hole where the bullet had entered. It was bleeding sluggishly, dark venous blood that looked black in the dim light. "God help me," she whispered, the prayer tumbling out into the freezing air. She didn't know who she was praying to, the God of the church that had condemned her, or the cold, indifferent God of the plains. But she prayed with a desperation that consumed her. She pressed a clean cloth hard against the wound. Cole cried out, his body arching off the pallet. "Hold him down!" Eliza shouted to the men. Through the long, terrifying night, the storm battered the shack, rattling the loose boards and threatening to tear the roof off. But inside, a battle was being waged that was far quieter and far more desperate. Eliza fought for Cole's life with every ounce of strength she possessed. She washed the wound with boiling water, ignoring the tremors in her own hands. She bound it tight with strips of petticoat she tore from her own dress. She propped his head in her lap, feeding him water drop by drop from a tin spoon, watching his throat work to swallow. His fever spiked in the deep hours of the night. He burned with a heat that radiated through her clothes. He thrashed, calling out names she didn't know, fighting ghosts from a past she could only imagine. "I am here," she whispered, rocking him gently. "I am right here. We are going to have a porch. Cole, we are going to sit on it and watch the sun go down and not be afraid. We are going to have coffee in china cups. We are going to be boring. Cole, just simple and boring and alive." She spoke of the future she refused to surrender, painting a picture of a life that was honest and tender. She poured her will into him, demanding that he stay, demanding that he not let the darkness win. Around 4 a.m, the wind died. The sudden silence was deafening. Eliza, exhausted beyond measure, her eyes burning and her body aching, felt a change. Cole's breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, deepened. It grew steady. The frantic heat of his skin began to cool, breaking into a sweat. She leaned over him, putting her ear to his chest. The heartbeat was there, stronger, slower. He opened his eyes. They were clear. The glaze of shock and fever was gone. "Eliza?" he whispered. Eliza slumped forward, burying her face in his neck. The relief hit her like a physical blow, robbing her of her last reserves of strength. She wept, silent, shaking sobs that racked her body. "You stayed," she choked out. "I told you," he rasped, his hand moving weakly to touch her hair. "I would be waiting." While the storm had raged in the foothills, the town had been a cauldron of its own. The death of Harlan Blackridge had shattered the order of things. In the saloon, on the street corners, and in the parlors, arguments flared. "He was defending his property," shouted a cattleman loyal to the Blackridge brand. "He was a thief and a murderer," countered a homesteader, emboldened by the truth Eliza had read from the ledger. The ledger became a ghost story, a myth. Some said Eliza had invented it. Others swore they saw the signatures. The town was divided, balanced on a knife edge between the old power and the new truth. But truth has a weight that is hard to ignore. A group of homesteaders, led by the widow Ellis, rode through the night to the railhead 40 miles away. They returned 2 days later, not alone. They brought a United States Marshal and a circuit judge, a man named Thaddeus Stone, who was known for a sour disposition and an absolute adherence to the written law. When Judge Stone arrived in town, he did not go to the hotel. He went to the bank. Thomas Avery tried to block the door. "This is a private institution," he blustered, though his face was the color of old parchment. "You have no jurisdiction here without cause." "I have cause," Judge Stone said, his voice like grinding stones. I have 20 sworn affidavits from citizens claiming you are running a criminal enterprise. Open the door, Mr. Avery, or the marshal will open it with an axe. Thomas opened the door. Where's the girl? The judge demanded. She is a fugitive, Thomas said, wiping sweat from his upper lip. She ran off with the killer. We shall see, the judge said, guided by John McCrae. The judge and the marshal rode out to the line shack, the journey across the hardened snow, under a sky that was a wide, relentless blue, was a stark reminder of the land's indifference. They rode past the burned ruins of the McCrae barn. They rode past the empty Ellis corral. The evidence of suffering was written on the landscape itself. When they reached the shack, Eliza met them at the door. She looked haggard, her dress stained with blood and soot, her hair loose and wild, but her eyes were clear. She did not look like a fugitive. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side tempered steel. She presented the ledger. She presented her notebook. She laid them on the rough table in front of the judge. Cole, pale and weak but propped up in the bunk, gave his testimony. He spoke of the orders to burn the barn. He spoke of the fence lines cut to starve cattle. He spoke of the ambush at the schoolhouse. Judge Stone read the ledger. He read for an hour in silence, turning the pages with a dry rustle that sounded loud in the small room. Finally, he closed the book. This is sufficient, the judge said. He stood up, adjusting his coat. Mr. Blackridge is beyond earthly justice, the judge declared. But Mr. Avery is not. His assets are frozen effective immediately. All foreclosures initiated in the last 6 months are suspended pending a full review. And Mr. Maddox. Cole looked up, tensing. The shooting of Mr. Blackridge appears to be a clear case of defense of another, the judge said, given the provocation and the threat to Miss Hart's life. I see no grounds for charges. You are free, son. Eliza let out a breath she felt she had been holding for weeks. She reached for Cole's hand, and he squeezed it, his grip weak but undeniably alive. The fall of Thomas Avery was quiet and pathetic. Stripped of his authority, he shrank. The investors from the East, getting wind of the scandal, pulled their backing. The bank was put under receivership a week after the investigation began. Thomas came to see Eliza. She was staying in the boarding house now, nursing Cole as he regained his strength. Thomas met her in the parlor. He looked smaller, his fine coat hanging loosely on his frame. Eliza, he said, attempting a smile that faltered. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. The pressure, the business, it makes men do things they regret. I do not think you regret it. Thomas, Eliza said, standing by the fireplace, I think you regret getting caught. I can fix this, Thomas said, stepping closer. I have money put aside. We can go to San Francisco. Start over. I can forgive you. Eliza, I can forgive the scandal, the indiscretion with the cowboy. We can have the life I promised. You will be comfortable. You will be safe. Eliza looked at him. She remembered the cold room behind the dress shop. She remembered the way he touched her arm like he was checking the quality of fabric. Comfort, she said softly. Yes, Thomas said, seizing on the word. A comfortable life. No freezing in shacks. No blood. Eliza shook her head. Comfort built on fear is not comfort. Thomas, it is a prison with velvet curtains. I have lived in enough cages. I will not walk into another one willingly. Thomas's face hardened. The mask slipped, revealing the sneering, small man beneath. You are a fool, he spat. You are choosing poverty. You are choosing a cripple in a patch of dirt. You will be dead in a year, worn out by this God-forsaken country. Maybe, Eliza said, but I will be free. She turned her back on him. Thomas stood there for a moment, impotent and furious, before turning and walking out of the boarding house and out of her life. In the weeks that followed, the town changed. It did not become a paradise. The wind still blew, the cold still bit, but the fear lifted. Blackridge's remaining hired guns, sensing the shift in the wind, drifted away like smoke. The homesteaders walked a little taller. They knew they were still poor, but they knew they wouldn't wake up to find an eviction notice on their door. The town's attitude toward Eliza was fractured. The wealthy matrons still whispered behind their hands when she passed, calling her a fallen woman, scandalized by her time in the shack with Cole. But when she walked past the mercantile, men tipped their hats with genuine respect. And when she visited the homesteads, she was welcomed not as a teacher or a charity worker, but as a hero. Cole recovered slowly. The bullet had missed his vital organs, but it had taken a toll. He walked with a limp for a long time, and he tired easily. He helped around the boarding house, fixing shutters, chopping wood, his movements stiff but determined. Every twinge of pain was a reminder that justice in the West was not an abstract concept. It was something you paid for in flesh and blood. When the first thaw arrived, turning the snow to mud and swelling the creeks, Eliza and Cole rode out to the edge of the settlement. There was a piece of land there, marginal land, rocky and swept by the wind, nestled against the rise of the foothills. It was land no cattleman wanted and no farmer had dared to claim. "This is it," Cole said, looking out over the scrub brush. "It is beautiful," Eliza said. "It is rocks and dirt." "Eliza," Cole laughed softly. "It is ours," she corrected. They went to the courthouse, where Judge Stone was still overseeing the dissolution of the Blackridge estate. They signed the papers. It cost them every dollar Eliza had saved and the last of Cole's wages. But when the judge stamped the deed, they looked at each other with a stunned wonder. They owned a piece of the earth. Building the home was the hardest work Eliza had ever done. It was grueling. They hauled lumber in the biting wind. They mixed mud for the chinking until their hands were raw. Dust devils spun across the flats, filling their eyes with grit. There were days when Eliza sat on a pile of uncut logs and cried from sheer exhaustion, and days when Cole threw his hammer down in frustration because his side ached too much to lift a beam. But they built it. They built a small cabin with a sturdy roof and a window that faced the sunrise. They planted a garden in soil that had to be coaxed with water hauled from the creek bucket by bucket. It was a hard life. It was a poor life, but it was an honest life. One afternoon, a wagon pulled up. It was Mrs. McCrae. Beside her on the seat was a small girl, no more than 7, with wide, frightened eyes. It was the youngest Ellis girl, orphaned and passed between neighbors who could barely feed their own. "She needs a place, Mrs." McCrae said apologetically. "Just for a while, until we can find kin back east." Eliza looked at Cole. He was leaning on his shovel, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the girl. He saw the fear in her posture, the same fear he had carried for 20 years. "She doesn't need kin back east," Cole said. "She needs a home. They took her in. They made a bed for her by the fire. They fed her stew and told her stories. They promised her she would not be uprooted again. And in caring for her, they healed the parts of themselves that had been broken by their own lost childhoods. Their romance was not the stuff of fairy tales. It was woven into the fabric of survival. It was in the shared laughter over bread that had burned in the oven. It was in the way their hands brushed when they were washing dishes in the tin basin. It was in the quiet, intense embraces at the end of the day, when the wind rattled the door and the fire popped in the hearth. It was a love that smelled of wood smoke and lye soap, a love that had calluses on its hands. On a night in late November, exactly 1 year after Eliza had arrived in the town, the temperature plummeted. The wind keened outside, a high, lonely sound that usually made folks huddle closer to the stove. But Eliza and Cole stepped outside. They wrapped themselves in heavy blankets and stood on the small porch they had built. The sky was a vast, crushing dome of black, strewn with stars so sharp they looked like shards of ice. The land stretched out before them, empty and cold and silent. "It is a big empty," Cole said quietly, his arm around her shoulders. Eliza leaned into him. She could feel the steady thrum of his heart against her back. She looked at the tiny square of yellow light spilling from their window onto the snow. "It looks so small against the dark. I'm still afraid sometimes," she admitted, her voice a wisp of vapor in the cold air. "I worry about the crops. I worry about what people say. I worry that the ghosts will come back." Cole turned her to face him. He looked down at her, his face shadowed, the scar a faint line on his skin. The ghosts don't have a place here. Eliza, he said, we built this. We fought for it. I know, she whispered. She looked up at him. She saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, but she also saw the peace that lived there now. When you look at me, the weight of the world feels lighter. It is as if you build a shelter around me just by being here. Cole pulled her close, burying his face in the hood of her cloak. The West will always be hard. Eliza, he murmured, the wind will always blow. People will always judge what they don't understand. Justice is a rare thing out here. But I tell you this, I would choose this. I would choose this rock and this wind and this fragile, honest life with you over 1,000 years of safety. Eliza rested her head against his chest. She listened to the wind howling across the miles of frozen prairie. She felt the bite of the cold on her cheeks. But inside the circle of his arms, she felt a heat that defied the winter. I have never felt anything like this, she whispered, the words drifting out into the vast night. Not the fear, not the cold, but this warmth, this belonging. She looked out at the dark horizon, then back at the light in their window. It is enough, she said. The story ends there, with the two of them standing at the edge of their land, the wind tugging at their clothes, the future uncertain but shared, the harsh reality of the West stretched out around them, indifferent and brutal. But the light from their cabin window glowed steadily behind them, a small, stubborn promise against the dark. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Eliza and Cole. It has been a journey through the snow and the heartache of the American West, and I hope you felt every moment of their struggle and their love. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below letting me know where in the world you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West so you never miss an adventure. And please, share your thoughts on the ending in English. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.